Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The International Development Secretary Priti Patel has apologised after admitting meeting the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other senior figures during an unofficial visit to Israel this summer. The BBC revealed on Friday that Ms Patel had held a series of undisclosed meetings during her holiday in August. James Landell is here with me. James, I'm not sure, what has she actually done wrong?
Well, George, when ministers go abroad and have official meetings, they're supposed to tell the Foreign Office, or at the very least bring their own officials. Priti Patel did neither here. Last week I reported that she'd had some meetings during her holiday in Israel. We now know there were 12, including, extraordinarily, with the Israeli Prime Minister. And at all these meetings, there were no civil servants, but there was a pro-Israel Conservative lobbyist. Now, this matters not just because there's always a risk of policy confusion if ministers are off having secret meetings, but it also matters because there is a risk that Ms Patel broke the Ministerial Code of Conduct. This says that ministers must ensure there's no perceived risk of a conflict of interest between their public duties and their private interest. Now, today, Ms Patel was summoned to Downing Street and told by the Prime Minister that these were the rules and she should follow them. Ms Patel apologised. Labour say she should resign. One minister said to me she was toast. I think Downing Street will be hoping that this disclosure and this apology will be enough for her to survive.
James, thank you very much.
A charity has warned that a woman being held in an Iranian jail may have her sentence increased because of remarks made by the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. The British-Iranian Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is currently serving a 5-year prison sentence after being accused of trying to overthrow the Iranian government, a charge she denies. Mr Johnson told a parliamentary committee last week that Mrs Zaghari-Ratcliffe was training journalists in Iran when she was arrested in 2016. Days later, she was summoned before a court where the Foreign Secretary's comments were cited as proof she was engaged in propaganda against the regime. Her former employer, the Thomson Reuters Foundation, say Mrs Zaghari-Ratcliffe was on holiday at the time of her arrest and that the Foreign Secretary should correct his mistake immediately. Well, in a statement this evening, the Foreign Office said the Foreign Secretary will be calling the Iranian Foreign Minister to raise again his serious concerns about the case and ensure his remarks are not misrepresented. The Foreign Secretary has not retracted his original comments.
And another cabinet minister has had to apologise today. The International Development Secretary, Priti Patel, met the Prime Minister this morning after it emerged last week she'd held undisclosed meetings with the Israeli government in the company of a lobbyist during a summer holiday in Israel. The statement she gave last week, claiming Boris knew about the visit, the point is that the Foreign Office did know about this, has now had to be clarified with a new statement today, accepting that the initial quote may have given the impression that the Secretary of State had informed the Foreign Secretary about the visit in advance, and clarifying that this was not the case. A full list of her meetings, also not forthcoming last week, has now been published. And in the last few minutes, Theresa May said she had accepted Priti Patel's apology and had spoken to her about the implications of the Ministerial Code.
And as if she hasn't got enough to worry about, the Prime Minister has another major problem tonight, this time with the Secretary of State for International Development, Priti Patel, who has, in effect, admitted to lying about some political meetings she had whilst on holiday in Israel. Even by the standards of political press releases, tonight's from her department was really quite something. Boris knew about the visit, she told The Guardian airily last Friday, implying it was all cleared back home. But tonight her department issued a blunt clarification. This quote may have given the impression she'd informed the Foreign Secretary in advance, the statement said, but she would like to take this opportunity to clarify that this was not the case.
The Prime Minister was in the unusual position last week of meeting the Israeli Prime Minister in London and being completely in the dark that only a couple of months before, the International Development Secretary had met him secretly in Israel. Priti Patel was called in to explain herself to the Prime Minister after it emerged that not only had she set up that meeting whilst on holiday, she then falsely suggested the Foreign Office knew all about it.
I have accepted the apology that she's given for the way she handled that particular visit. And I've spoken to her about the Ministerial Code and about the implications of the Ministerial Code.
The International Development Secretary held 12 meetings during her holiday in Israel in August. That included the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as the Foreign Minister and the Minister for Public Security. Last week in The Guardian, she appeared to suggest the Foreign Office was aware before her trip. Boris knew about the visit, she said. The point is that the Foreign Office did know about this. Boris knew about the trip. Today, in an extraordinary statement, she clarified that, saying that this was not the case, adding that the Foreign Secretary did become aware of the visit, but not in advance of it. That warrants a proper investigation, say Labour.
As the Prime Minister, she should be showing leadership and responding to the cry out that is saying we need to know what was discussed at those meetings. We don't know what was discussed. Priti Patel has, in my view, misled the public.
It won't have been a comfortable meeting for Priti Patel here in Downing Street. Ministers have been out on their ear for less, but the brutal truth is the Prime Minister is in no position to fire her. She simply can't afford to lose anyone else. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
Well, with the growing numbers of Conservative MPs and ministers even now facing tough questions, it's important to remember that even with the DUP, Theresa May only has an effective majority of 13. So in addition to Priti Patel, who we just heard about, Damien Green, the PM's deputy in all but name, is also under pressure, as is Minister Mark Garnier, while Sir Michael Fallon resigned as Defence Secretary and Chris Pincher stood down as a whip. There have been allegations about the behaviour of Dover MP Charlie Elphick and Stephen Crabb in the marginal Pressley Pembrokeshire seat, as well as MPs Daniel Kaczynski and Dan Poulter. Well, our political editor Robert Peston is here now to talk about all this. I mean, we just go through the numbers. You're fully aware of them. I mean, this is a really serious threat for the Prime Minister, isn't it?
So if she is forced by the appalling behaviour of any MPs to actually throw an MP out of the party and force a by-election, that's a catastrophe for her, because, as you say, she hasn't got a natural majority. She's relying on the DUP. One DUP MP came up to me today and said, "Are we having a general election next week?" Ha ha. And he wasn't really trying to be funny.
Hilariously funny joke,
but it is unbelievably fragile. Now, my own view is that the greater risk to Theresa May is not that the Tories are forced to go to the country in a general election, but more that her own MPs lose confidence in her, because, you know, it's quite difficult to describe what's happened today as anything other than a shambles. I mean, you know, we had Priti Patel going off to see almost all of the Israeli government, including the Prime Minister, without telling the Foreign Secretary in advance, without getting a briefing from the Foreign Office in advance. You know, there are almost no country-to-country relationships for Britain more important than that, or more sensitive than that with Israel. And for her to go off on some freelancing operation holiday, I think in normal circumstances, she'd have been out the door.
OK, well, let us see. It's certainly interesting times, Robert. For now, thank you very much indeed.
After a weekend of more allegations of sexual misconduct, Conservative, Labour and SNP, the latter led to the resignation of Scotland's Children Minister, the tally of investigations reads like this. 10 MPs are facing questions, 1 Cabinet Minister has resigned, and another is the subject of a Cabinet Office inquiry. Theresa May met other Westminster leaders today to discuss the scandal and afterwards announced a new grievance procedure for parliamentary staff. But it was also a very eventful day for the government. I'm joined by Chris Cook. Chris, there's been a lot going on.
I think that's right. And I think we'd been quite surprised to be told this morning that meeting about sexual harassment processes wasn't going to be the most important thing. The single most important piece of news that's come out today relates to Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who is an Iranian Briton who's currently in prison in Iran. She was arrested last year at Tehran airport. She's being held on a charge of trying to overthrow the government of sedition. She denies all the allegations against her. She says she was there to visit family. Last week, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, told the Foreign Affairs Select Committee that he said the following words: "When I look at what Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was doing, she was simply teaching people journalism as I understand it." The thing is, that is not what she said in court in Iran. And the Iranian High Council for Human Rights said over the weekend that Mr. Johnson's comments shed new light on what she had been doing and that it showed that she had visited the country for anything but a holiday. The Thomson Reuters Foundation, who are employers, have urged the Foreign Office to correct this mistake, which is obviously undermining her defence.
And what has Boris Johnson said?
Well, we've got this very fudgy statement from the Foreign Office that says the UK is continuing to do all it can to secure her release, but and he'll be calling the Iranian Foreign Minister to try to sort of make it clear that's not what he meant.
That's not what he meant, but has he apologised to the family?
Not as far as we know, no.
So it's not just about Boris Johnson, because it looks like the International Development Secretary, Priti Patel, has been doing a bit of freelancing.
She has. So last week, it's a very odd story. Last week, we learned that she took time out from her holiday in Israel to go and meet Yair Lapid, who is a centrist politician. And this was a little bit odd because she hadn't told the Foreign Office she was doing it. And bluntly, there are rules in place that say that ministers should tell the Foreign Office what they're up to, so we don't end up with more than one foreign policy at a time. We've got some quotes here that she gave to The Guardian. She told The Guardian last week, Boris knew about the visit. The point is the Foreign Office did know about this. Boris knew about the trip. She's had to put out a statement today saying, this quote may have given the impression that the Secretary of State had informed the Foreign Secretary about this visit in advance. The Secretary of State would like to take this opportunity to clarify that this was not the case. So she's been forced to put out a statement saying she lied. There's a second quote here. She was asked about whether she only met Yair Lapid, and she said, the stuff that's out there, that's it as far as I'm concerned. So that's to say there was no, she didn't meet anyone else. They've had to put out another statement. This quote may be read as implying the Secretary of State was saying the meetings that had so far been publicly reported were the only ones that took place. We now know that's untrue. She met about a dozen people, including Benjamin Netanyahu.
So wait a minute. She was meeting a dozen people, including the Prime Minister of Israel.
Yep.
She didn't have any civil servant with her.
Nope.
She didn't tell the Prime Minister she was going, and she didn't tell the Foreign Secretary, and she still got a job.
That's right.
Why?
Well, I think you can take this and a lot of other things going on in Westminster at the moment as a sort of sign of Theresa May's fundamental weakness. This is not the action of a strong Prime Minister standing by her chosen International Development Secretary. She's just paralysed on all fronts at the moment, and another reshuffle is really not what she needs.
Chris Cook, thanks very much indeed.
All right, you like.
Can we have a look at the Mail?
Get on.
Whoa. Can we look at the Mail? Priti Patel.
This is humiliating for Priti Patel, the International Development Secretary, because it's found out now, she's been forced to admit that on a holiday to Israel in the summer with a Conservative donor who's very Conservative Friends of Israel, who's been running it for a long time. She met Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, wasn't disclosed. The Foreign Office didn't know what she was up to. The Prime Minister didn't know what she was up to. She tried to play it all down when it first emerged. Now she's had to admit 12 meetings. And
what sort of holiday was that?
Extraordinary, not a very good one. An extraordinary statement was issued by her department trying to apologise for her and square it with. Basically, she's accused of lying in the recent past, being taken to Downing Street, dressed down by the Prime Minister. She should be sacked. Theresa May was a strong Prime Minister. She would sack her. She's not a strong Prime Minister. She can't sack her because you do not go to a foreign power and a Prime Minister and be running your freelance foreign policy and no doubt a campaign for the leadership down the line.
Was discussed,
no,
though,
exactly. Exactly.
What, she went to see all these Israeli politicians? Just
I do think
a little holiday, isn't it lovely? Oh, nice beaches here, you know. Come on. You know.
Look, I'm trying my best.
I know. Israel-Palestine, one of the enduring conflicts, part of a very unstable region there in the Middle East. And she blunders in, then she starts dictating international development policy when she comes back without people knowing where she's been. I mean, come on, this is just bonkers stuff. It's a government falling apart.
I don't think you need to be sacked for it, but I think it was very odd to go and see the Prime Minister of Israel and not tell the British Prime Minister you were going to go and see.
Who then subsequently met Netanyahu last Thursday, we believe, without knowing Priti Patel had been.
Can we just have a look at the Sun? Boris's gaffe, as they call it. I mean, this actually is... gaffe doesn't seem the right word to me.
This is really, really unfortunate. This is the woman who's been in an Iranian jail for 18 months. She's a mum. The British government have been trying to get her out. And Boris Johnson... her defence has always been that she was on holiday in Iran. She's got dual British-Iranian nationality. Boris Johnson has put his size 9 in it and said, no, actually, she was teaching...
journalism, it claimed, which she wasn't.
While she was there, which, of course, the Iranians have seized on to say, therefore she was propagating propaganda and now there's potential for her prison sentence to be extended. Now, Boris has to apologise for this, and probably in public, because it is a mistake.
Interestingly, I think just about every paper, I've not looked at them all, but we glanced at them, every paper has the Priti Patel story and the Boris Johnson story, and they're torn across all the papers, from Labour papers, Mirror, Guardian, right across the Tory papers, Sun Mail, all the same, that these are big gaffes, big blunders. And Boris Johnson is not a joke when he's blundering in there and putting the safety of a British subject at risk by being inaccurate, and then he doesn't apologise and correct it. So he's got incompetence topped by arrogance, and it's a toxic mix.
It's a genuine mistake, but he should apologise
in public
and get it sorted, because it is a bad mistake.
Yeah.